Welcome to the 4040 Pastors Podcast. I'm your host, Arthur J. James. And if you're a bivocational pastor or church leader looking to remain fulfilled in ministry and life, then you've landed at the right spot. Let's jump in. Today we have Denise Mock, a certified life and marketing coach and the director of assimilation at Greenwood Church in North Carolina. Denise believes leadership should leave you energized, not exhausted. She's a leadership coach, speaker, ministry strategist, and recovering people pleaser who loves helping leaders carry less and lead more. Whether she's coaching executives, serving churches, or helping organizations untangle people and process problems, Denise has a gift for making complicated things feel simple. It is my honor to share with the 4040 Pastor Podcast, Miss Denise Mock. Denise, welcome to the 4040 Pastors Podcast.
Thank you. I am delighted to be here.
Thanks for accepting the invitation. Listen, I want to jump right in. You've got so much of a wealth of background and information, particularly as it relates to helping women and ministry leaders avoid burnout, which is right up the 4040 Pastors alley. Would you share with us, for that pastor, that ministry leader that's watching, who's in two worlds, two callings, what your world actually looks like on a weekly basis, a normal week, with you being a certified coach and also the director of assimilation at your church?
Wow, that's a great question. People often see the platform, but they rarely see the balancing act of being in two different worlds. I think for years, there's a ministry world of loving people, solving problems, leading teams, but there's also a different world, in the coaching world, serving, doing organizational stuff, operation stuff. And, sometimes my mornings are in meetings like you were talking about earlier. The afternoons could be coaching clients, and in the evenings, I could be doing stuff at church. So it's not really as much about working two different jobs. It's about living out one unique calling in two different places.
So for the person who's in that world, can you talk to us a little bit about your journey and what gave you a passion for helping people avoid burnout, specifically women in ministry?
Well, I think, you and I talked about this a couple of weeks ago, but I think we provide the thing that we wish that we had had when we were in ministry. And I think I wish that I had had somebody like years ago when I had started, just a safe place to be. I wish that I'd had some people who uniquely understood the challenge. And I think, being in two different worlds, and they're both very challenging, but also very rewarding. And it's one of those things you can't not do when you're, I've worked in secular jobs without ministry, and I've worked in ministry without secular jobs, and I've done a lot of different things. But I think when there's a calling on your life, you can't help but show up and do the thing that God's called you to do, whether you're a missionary in the marketplace or whether it's, on staff, with a church.
So you have more than 30 years of professional experience and ministry experience. You said they're both challenges as well as successes. What's been one of the greatest challenges that you've experienced in your leadership roles?
Man, I think loving people, walking beside people, the messiness, of working with people. Paperwork's a whole lot easier than people, but also people. I love people. I love coming alongside of them. So it's the coin. It's it's both the reward and the privilege, and also, it can be very trying at times.
On the flip side of that question, that's part of the challenge. What about your greatest success in being in ministry as a bivocational leader?
I think the greatest success is walking through some really hard stuff and seeing God show up in the middle of it. So whether it's a hospital room and a trying diagnosis, but I think for me, the most fun thing is seeing the miracle of ministry happen, seeing God show up in impossible circumstances. And if you're not serving, then you're often not going to see that, knowing that the situation seemed impossible or the circumstance seemed there was no hope in it. And then out of nowhere, God shows up and does something that only he can do. And that is That is my favorite thing.
Is there a particular story that comes to mind or a ministry moment where you've seen God show up in your bivocational space that keeps you going because of situations
There
like that?
yeah, there are so many stories. I'm trying to think of one I can share that n crossover confidentiality. Probably, meeting a guy who was homeless and on the street and just watching him rebuild his life, and people come alongside of him and his family, he burned a lot of bridges thanks to addiction and, he wasn't sure what the next step would look like. But one by one, we got to see him find a job and then save for a car and, find a home and that kind of stuff. That's always fun. We'd also had a lady in our church who just had major panic attacks. She just had a really hard time putting one foot in front of the other. But her determination to pull into the parking lot, and she would sit in her car, and then she would have a panic attack, and then she would leave. And then the next week, she would come, she would park in the same place, and she would get out of her car, and then she would have a panic attack, and she would get back in her car, and she would leave. And the next week, you would see her pull into the parking lot, park in the same place, get out of her car, shut the door, walk halfway across the parking lot, have a panic attack, and leave. And so when she finally was able to walk in to the church, our whole servant team went nuts because we knew how hard it had, how hard that journey had been and what looked like nothing to someone else, those of us watching. I mean, it was just beautiful. And now she serves on our guest service team and she welcomes other people in. So that's just, like I said, and when you think about it, when you think about the scripture where Jesus was at the wedding and he was turning, water into wine, it wasn't the guests that knew what was going on. It was actually the servants who knew the miracle that had happened. And so I mean, it's fun to see. It's fun to see what only God can do and get a front row seat to that.
I'd love to ask you this based on your background and experience. Why do you think there's such a vast amount of people who have anxiety today? It's one of the leading causes as it relates to people burning out and dealing with stress. When you think about in either role as a coach, a life coach, and or the director of assimilation at your church, what have you seen that you believe that's been the major reason for that? And what are you doing through your coaching and through ministry to help with?
Oh man, that's a great question. Personally, I just think it's a bait of Satan. I mean, personally, I think it's just something that God uses to bring people back to himself, but I also think anxiety is the one thing that keeps us distracted from what God is doing, and the enemy uses anxiety to keep us stuck because, we live in such a polished, performance-oriented society. I didn't grow up with social media, so, I think a lot about our 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds who everything they do is there's a spotlight on it, and so as an older person, I can just show you my highlighted reel. But, everything, in the 20 and 30 years old, I mean, they're taking pictures of their supper. Like, I just think there's so much emphasis put on the performance of things. And I think that creates a lot of anxiety. So, not only from a mental health standpoint, but I just think we're just all consumed with what you're doing and what I'm doing and how do I compare to what you're doing and what are you doing? And then you add FOMO in there, the fear of missing out. And if you're going to do a podcast, then I'm going to do a podcast. And how does my podcast compare to your podcast? And well, you have way more followers. I mean, you are author James. And so, so there's just too much comparison and too much outside of just the mental illness. It's just, our world is set up for anxiety. And it's the number one thing my doctors that I work with say that people come in and struggle with. Racing thoughts, can't sleep at night, panic attacks, feeling out of control, feeling like everybody's watching them. It's just too much.
That whole pressure of always being on or always feeling not enough. I love the information that you share on your website and through the resources you provide. Can you talk to us about how you personally got there? I know you provide advice and coaching, and even as it relates to being someone that's overcome abuse and things that have changed and challenged you to be a success, so you can lead others to success. Where was it? And you even talk about the loneliness of leadership and specifically loneliness of leadership as a woman who's a leader. Can you share where you first felt those feelings of loneliness as a female leader?
Oh my gosh, probably, definitely growing up, seeing things, experiencing things. There was a lot of loneliness. And then I think as a leader, you know, feeling left out or not included, or, people wanting access to your life, full access without understanding boundaries. I think on the leadership standpoint, especially in ministry, I think it's really complicated because you carry a lot of things in ministry, like you're meeting people at hospitals and you're sharing prayer requests. And so you hold a lot of confidential stuff, but rarely does anybody come alongside and say, "Hey, how can I pray for you?" Or, "Hey, I see that you're pulling a lot of hours. Like, what can I do to help you?" Or when you do ask for help, you have a bold moment and you're like, "Hey, I'm drowning." And they're like, "Yeah, I got to go get my hair done." And it's kind of like, I think the care is not always reciprocal. And not that it has to be, but I think one of the major things I did not do well is I wasn't vulnerable as a leader. And I didn't always choose the right people to support me. And so I think, and that breeds more loneliness because if you pick the wrong confidant, or you're a little too vulnerable with the wrong people, then you become the prayer request on Tuesday. And so it's hard to carry things. And I think early on, I didn't know what was mine to carry and what was, somebody else's to carry. So I carried all of it because I wanted to be the hero in the story. Oh, Denise can do it. But guess what happened? The more I said yes, the more things I had to say yes to. And then when I finally said, "Hey, I can't do this," they're like, "Oh, you're weak." We should have got, and it's just, it goes back to those labels and that comparison. And I think as a woman in ministry, there's a lot of responsibility, both invisible and visible. And so the invisible stuff is the stuff that you're doing that no one sees, like flushing toilets and preparing for Sunday and making sure we have the right kind of creamer to go in our coffee, But there's also the visible responsibilities. And those are often things that everybody wants to, not any of your listeners, but or not your congregation, but a lot of people like to criticize the things that are visible, not knowing the weight that came with those visibility responsibilities. So,
So on the 4040 podcast, Pastors podcast, we talk about the two world tax. And part of what you described is just that being able to have the invisible jobs, the margin that's missing because there's so much to do. And it's this invisible tax that in being in both worlds that you have these other jobs. So can you talk to us a little bit more about how you personally have been able to manage a successful coaching business, but at the same time be the director of assimilation for your church? That's a big job. And for those that may not know that title, can you tell us a little bit more about what is accomplished in your job at the church with the ministry? And then how does that relate to your job as a coach?
well, they're very different, but they're very similar. And so, on the assimilation side, I get to help connect people into the life and ministry of the church. So a lot of my responsibilities are, first impressions, guest services, making sure our safety team is, in place, making sure, our coffee team is in place. And so we probably manage about 100 plus volunteers on a Sunday, and I love every minute of it. My favorite thing is helping people who decide that they're going to, call our church their home. Is helping them get plugged into a community group, which is really big in our church, and then a serving family, and helping them find places to serve, because we don't really believe that we put warm bodies in cold spots. We believe that God will give us you know, the people that we need to serve, and so it's just helping them find their place to serve. And then if they find a place to serve and they don't like it, we help move them out of it. Hey, you know what? This isn't your jam. Let's find something that's more aligned with where your giftings are. And so that's a super fun process. And it's all about really developing people. So guess what I do on the coaching side? Developing people, putting systems in place, coaching and helping people, in counseling, we're all focused on like what's wrong or problem oriented. In the coaching world, we're all focused on what do you want, and creating a system to get there. So in both capacities, I'm helping people figure out what they want and make a plan to get there. And sometimes I get to be a part of that plan. And sometimes we have to bring other people in to make that plan happen. But I think people are always worth the investment. And when you were talking about tax, there's an emotional tax to both places. There's a boundary tax, if I can piggyback off of what you're saying. There's availability tax. There's a decision tax. So I think the taxes that you talk about in your podcast and even in your newsletters, it's an emotional tax, it's a decision tax, it's a boundary tax, it's a visibility tax, it's a spiritual there's a lot of different components in that. But I think when you have a calling to do something, I think God prepares you for that tax. I think our part is just to make sure we're showing up in the right areas, doing the right thing, in the right seats on the bus so that we're not doing something that somebody else is supposed to do, which is where, we talk about, carrying less and leading more. I think as leaders, sometimes we are trying to do everything for everybody, and that killed Jesus. So I think when we think about what we're supposed to do, we show up and we do the thing that God has called us to do, and He gives us margin for that. When we show up and I'm trying to do what you're supposed to do and what I'm supposed to do and what somebody else is supposed to do, there's no margin and there's no peace in that.
So you're speaking parts of my language as a former hotel manager and a ministry leader and a pastor. I believe in having people, as you mentioned, in the right seats on the bus, good to great, but also knowing that there has to be a passion and a proficiency and not just a pulse. How have you all, in your role as director of ministry, director of assimilation, rather, at your church, what are some of the resources and tools that you utilize to ensure that people who are present are on the right bus in the right seat? Because I personally think that helps to avoid burnout, because when people are working in a place where they have a passion and a proficiency, everybody wins. So how do you all do that at your church at Greenwood?
But there's a lot of different ways that we've done it over the years. I've been there for about 8.5 years, but even before that, we would do assessments. We would do, finding your place in ministry. We would do a disc assessment. We would do all kinds of things. But I think the thing that has been most helpful for us as we've assimilated people and, helping them find a place to serve is more just listening to their heart, listening and making them feel like we need them, which we do, and making them feel like they belong. Now, there are different places that people serve that have higher capacities. And so I think as we get to know people, there's a very, we invite them in lower capacity places. And, it gives our staff a chance to kind of get to know them, rub shoulders with them. And then as they join community groups and they serve, we see their ability to be dependable. Are they showing up? Are they, if I'm having to chase you, do you really want to be here? Like if I'm always saying, hey, dude, where are you? So just being in community with them and then, helping our volunteers, setting the expectation and then going, hey, like, let's follow up what's going on. But, just being shoulder to shoulder with them and, and letting them know our pastor does a really good job at casting vision. This is what we need. This is what we want. It's not really about us. Every Sunday morning we're praying, Lord, help us see and serve people well today. And for some people, I mean, that's helping them find their coffee and their seat. For other people, it's, helping them get connected to our children's ministry. For other people, it's a peppermint and a piece of chocolate. I mean, people, for some people it's providing earplugs for them, but just doing whatever we can to serve them so we remove the barrier so that they can hear from Jesus.
Now, with your background and experience, I am dying to ask you this question, and my apologies, it was not a part of the questions I sent you, pre-prep questions I sent you. So, as a pastor and a ministry leader in creating culture, how do you do it? And what I mean by do it, how do you allow people to feel like they're needed without coming across as needy?
It's a great question. How do I help them feel they're needed? Is that the question?
Yes. Without feeling needy as a ministry leader, that we gotta have, because the old John Maxwell phrase, "You
Yeah.
can't lead people if you need people." How do you work through that balance of letting people feel that they belong, that like they belong and that they're needed without coming across as being quote unquote needy?
Well, I think the first thing for me I had to realize is people aren't going to help me. I need to plug them in to help in the church. So I had to kind of remove me from that quotient and I have to rely on God to equip his church. And so, there's a couple of times on Sunday morning, I already know I'm starting to get text message. I'm not going to be here. I'm not going to be here. Something happened, whatever. And I start stressing. And then I'm reminded God takes care of his church. And so out of the blue, different people will show up. It's not their week to serve and they'll show up. So God takes care of his church. But I do think, we pray for people to come alongside of us, but we also, it doesn't matter if we need help or not. We're always going to say we need help because we're about a bigger purpose. We're about, like a lady told me Sunday, she's like, you have plenty of people in team 4. I don't think I want to serve anymore. I'm like, we don't have enough people. And I had to explain to her what we're doing on team 4. So our team 4, we have a lot of people in recovery. And so team 4 is all about partnering our volunteers with our recovery community to help them serve together. So it looks like a really large team, but it's not because the purpose on that team is way different. And so it's a very large team, but I'm trying to mix. I want our recovery friends to serve alongside of our non recovery friends so that they can build a relationship. And so when I told her that, she's like, oh my gosh. She goes, I had no idea that was the mission. I said, yeah, it's the mission. So even though it's not overt, there's a method to the madness on the back end of things. And I think as we pull people in, I've created positions in our church. My pastor thinks I'm crazy, but if somebody comes in and they're like, you know what? I'm really good at making cinnamon rolls. You know what? I am so glad you said that because that's exactly what we need. And I'll create something for them to do. I had one lady that really felt passionate. She had worked, in our communion area in another church. And so guess what? I partnered her with our communion team, created a whole nother group of people to serve so that they can rub shoulders with other people and have that connection. And now there's a whole bunch of people in that place. So, there are places, children's ministry is always one of the areas that we always need extra people, community group leaders. I mean, there's some strategic places that we need more help, but you know what? God always provides it. But I think rubbing shoulders, telling people what their bigger mission is how we get people involved. And I'll be honest with you, sometimes we're inviting people not to serve. I know that sounds really weird, but sometimes people are there for the wrong reasons or they're not committed to the level that we need commitment. And so sometimes we're inviting people to not serve. And that feels really kind of yucky sometimes, but God always provides the people that he, this and you've spoke about this, that, the body functions when everybody's in its place, and the church is the same way. So everybody wants to be an eye, but nobody wants to be a liver. Well, the liver doesn't do what it's supposed to do. The eyes aren't going to work, you know? And so I think that casting that vision constantly, this is what we're called to do. And this is, it may not be glamorous, changing diapers in children's ministry isn't glamorous, but for the parents who drop that baby off, they need to know they're taken care of. Cleaning toilets aren't glamorous, but you know what? You do whatever you have to do. And I can't tell you how many Sunday mornings I've got a mop in my hand, not because I want kudos, but because somebody has spilt coffee and we got to get things ready for the next service, So you just do what you need to do. But almost always, if I have a mop on my hand, somebody is coming to grab it and saying, hey, Miss Denise, what do you need me to do? I'm like, front, right, corner, coffee's all over the floor. And we got to get prepped for the next service. So, or picking up communion. I know that we have communion on the first Sunday of every month. And so between services, we're picking up communion cups and picking up, whatever, getting things reset for the next service.
So when I hear you talk about creating positions, whether that's formally or informally, I saw you light up a little bit because putting people in places that they have a passion for, and again, of course, with proficiency. But talk to us a little bit about that for that leader, male or female, who does not have the mastery of the liver ministry, we'll call it that. Because I think some of the reason why some of us in ministry leadership have stress and things lead to burnout because we're not willing to deal with having those crucial conversations. What's something you would say to a leader who is avoiding those conversations and is causing them stress because they don't see it? I love how you painted it, the liver myth. If I didn't have my liver, I'd be in big trouble, but it's not visible. But just because a ministry gift is not visible doesn't mean it's not valuable. But what would be, as a coach and as a ministry leader, what would be your advice to someone who's struggling with uninviting someone to do ministry?
Do it fast, do it quick, do it with discernment because I think I was over Christian education ministry at another church a few years ago. And we went through, finding your place in ministry. And it was a whole process that we did. And in that process, there was somebody that was in the wrong seat in the bus and everybody was scared of it. And this particular person had a very strong personality, had a lot of opinions about things. And I had met with them a couple of different times. Hey, tell me what tell me about what you're doing. And there was just complaints and criticisms and all of that. And I said, well, it sounds like this really isn't your place. And they said to me, well, if I don't do it, who will? I said, you know what? That's not our problem. Our problem is to get you in the right place so that you can do the thing that God wants you to do. Because if you're in the right place, you're not going to be whining and complaining about everything else going on around you. And I had no idea. I mean, that came out my mouth before I even realized it. And so then I got in my car and I was like, well, that was fun. Let's see what happens. And so and I had the backing of my senior pastor, so that was great, but I was a little nervous how all that would work out. And so this person resigned. They always do the public, and of course they threw some shade in there and was like, Denise told me, that it's time for me to go and all this stuff. And so, but the minute she announced her, departure or her exit, she never left the church, but, she was still around, but her departure and exit from that ministry, three people instantly was like, hey, how can I help?
Wow.
And so sometimes people aren't going to show up and volunteer if there's not a need there. So, like my personality, if it was something I felt like I needed to do, I would show up and say, "Hey, if you need help, let me know." But these people were already kind of in the background, feeling a nudge that way, but didn't feel needed. So it wasn't until we moved this person out of that place that they had a place to step up. And so as soon as this person was removed, invited to serve somewhere else, then did they have the ability to lead? And last I checked, they're still leading in that area and it's been many, many years.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds like, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but here's what I'm hearing and how my mind thinks, that sometimes when we're not willing to or afraid to make the tough decisions because we're on the verge of burnout, being a bivocational ministry leader, that we could be possibly blocking our blessing because we won't deal with the hard conversations. Would that be an accurate
Yes,
assessment from your perspective?
absolutely. I think more times than not, avoiding difficult conversations are never gonna work out well for me. Now, I'm not saying that's the truth for everybody, but for me, when God's called me to do something, I do it as quickly and as swiftly as I can because I don't wanna get in my head about it, when it's like, "This is what we need to do." So I just lean into it and go, "God, you're gonna have to help me do this so I don't screw it up." And almost I mean, whether there was another situation where I was invited into a church to help on the operations side as a consultant, and there were some wrong people in the wrong seats of the bus. And I went to the pastor and I said, "You want my opinion?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "You got some people in the wrong seats of the bus." He's like, "What does that mean?" And I told him what that meant. And he's like, "You really think so?" I said, "Well, let's get in a helicopter and go above this and see what we see." And it wasn't until I kind of made some observations, he's like, "Oh man, you're right." And so he was too emotionally invested where I could come in and see some of the stuff because I wasn't close to it. And so I said, "What would happen?" And so we had to have a hard conversation. So I went to their house and talk to them, about what service looked like and that kind of thing. And, they were invited out of that position and there were some strong feelings about it. But the minute they were invited out and the dust settled, there were other people that were ready to take over and do the thing, that they were called to do, and that confirmation, even though it was hard, I think a lot of things that we perceive hard are just unfamiliar. So in that unfamiliarness, hard, we avoid conflict, but conflict is nothing but an opportunity to see God do what only He can do. And in both those situations, I was just a messenger, but I had a front row seat to see what God was going to do, and He did it. He didn't need me to do it, but He used me to do it. And because of that, some people got to really see and experience God in a different way. And I'm always going to be on board with that. Like I don't love my husband says I eat conflict for breakfast. I don't. But if it's gonna move us closer to where we need to be, heck, why are we not doing it?
Now, let me ask you this. What percentage of burnout do you think is tied to this whole issue of not dealing with the hard stuff in ministry as a leader? I'd love to hear your take on that.
285%? A lot. A lot. I think a lot of our burnout, and you're the expert on burnout, but I think a lot of our burnout comes from not doing hard stuff. and not having the bold courage to step up and take care of stuff. And I really think if we're gonna have courage, we're not gonna have courage without opportunities to be courageous. So if I wanna learn to be brave, I'm not gonna read about it. God's gonna give me opportunities to be brave. It's like patience. I don't learn patience by reading a book. I learn patience because God gives me opportunities to practice it. And it's the same thing like with burnout. Like, I think we let a lot of things go and we passively hope that God's going to miraculously, and sometimes He does fix it. But a lot of times He's asking us to do bold things, bold and courageous things. And sometimes it's not about them. Sometimes it's about us. Doing hard things isn't about letting hard days win. It's about moving past our comfort zone. And you know all about that, moving past our comfort zone and doing something a little scary that makes our heart beat faster because there's a greater purpose on the other end of it.
Wow, good stuff. I want to go a little bit deeper now in the conversation tied to the whole issue of isolation and loneliness as a leader, particularly a bivocational leader. Talk to us a little bit about where your sense of being okay with the health of loneliness that is not isolation, if that makes sense. I think you read one of your posts that shared just because leadership is lonely doesn't mean that you have to have isolation. Can you unpack that a little bit tied to that question?
Well, I think the whole reason, if I'm honest, the whole reason I became a coach is because in ministry, I found myself lonely. I found myself being without a safe place. And I felt like I was the only person who felt that way. Because when I would reach out to my colleagues who were serving at other places, everything was fun and everything was good and everything was wonderful. And I'm like, okay, I'm the only one that's jacked up. Got it. So then, you kind of pull in like a little roly poly and you're like, well, then there's must be something wrong with me. And so when I became a coach, I realized that I wasn't the only one. And I realized that there are just people that aren't sharing what they truly believe. And so when I actually became a coach 17 years ago, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be the safe place for people to process feelings and to handle overwhelm or to talk through situations and circumstances. But you can show up and tell people they can trust you, but they don't always know they can trust you. But I think when we think about loneliness, especially in living in two worlds, like you talk about, and I think that's the major emotional tax is that, who can we be vulnerable with? Who, like I said earlier, who can we share our feelings and thoughts with that doesn't become a prayer request of gossip? Will people see us? Will they be disappointed? Because I really don't think our main thing is, I think as leaders, I don't know about on your end, but on my end, I don't think rejection or the fear of rejection is our main issue. I think it's, are they going to be disappointed with me because I can't carry this? Are they going to be disappointed with me because I dropped this? And I think as a woman in leadership, how much is too much? And oftentimes I know that I don't realize I've carried too much until it's already on my plate. So how do I get it off my plate? Because now I realize that, it's too much. And that loneliness just spirals. Like, I can't do this. I don't know I'm going to do this. I'm not enough. And then not having that support system. So once I started doing coaching and ministry, I started building better support systems because then I wasn't all in my head. I knew that this is what I needed to do to avoid burnout. This is what I needed to do. And this may not be everybody's, formula, but for me, I needed some strategic people in my life who I could go to whenever I was feeling a certain kind of way.
So that is a good, again, great insight to share. And as we talk about the loneliness, as we talk about being in two worlds and the tax that comes with that, I want to ask you as well, when it comes to coming to the place where you're able to be bold and make those decisions, what would you say to the person who says, well, Denise, I'm not like you or Arthur. I don't, deal with conflict well, or because I've been in this situation so long, I don't have the confidence. I know you speak to women in particular about identity, and I love your resources on lead her leadership, great resources. But can you share with us what would be as a coach, your advice to someone who says, I don't have an outgoing personality and I don't want to offend people in the church?
Yeah, so I think, in regards to leadership and, for me, I don't think it has anything to do with personality. I think it has a lot to do with calling. because, if God's going to equip the people he calls, then he's going to give us what we need. I think we just have to be really intentional about what we need. So if I'm talking to a church secretary in Alabama, he's going to give her something different than, the elder in North Carolina. You know, we're uniquely positioned where God has placed us and our needs are different. So, it's not an introvert extrovert thing. It's a what do you need to be the best version of yourself? And, in the coaching realm, sometimes it takes, because I primarily coach women, it sometimes takes 6 weeks for women to even decide what they want. So when I say, "Hey, what is it that you want?" Because we're solution focused, we're not problem oriented. And so, I'm like, "Hey, what do you want?" It takes sometimes women because nobody's told them what they wanted. And so when you get really clear about what you want, then you can get even clearer about what you need. But I don't think it's a personality thing. I think it's this is where God has placed you. What is it that you want? And once we figure out what we want, then we can put together what we need. And sometimes what we need is not more things. We need peace. We need 10 minutes on our deck in total silence to recover. Sometimes we need a nap on a Wednesday afternoon before we do church on Wednesday night. And what
Amen.
each of us needs is totally different. And how we recharge is totally different. So if I'm looking at my husband, this sounds bad, Arthur, but if I'm looking at my husband and he's breathing and it's getting on my nerves, it's not his problem, it's mine. And so I know when my husband is chewing too loudly and he's breathing, and I'm like, could you please stop? It's not a him issue, it's a me issue. Girlfriend needs a nap. And so knowing what we need and being able to take care of ourselves is as much a part of burnout and avoiding it as anything else we can do. And so, we got to know what we want, but we also got to know what we need. And God provides what we need, but we've got to be self aware to know, okay, when my husband is making noises and he's breathing and it's getting on my every last nerve, he's not a bad husband. I'm not a bad wife. I've reached a level of capacity that I'm done. And me pushing through that moment isn't helpful. Me deciding to add 14 more things to do it's not going to turn out well. Go take the nap.
That's good. That's good. That's practical. That's good. I want to ask you this question because a big part of our focus today was on leadership and leadership that can be lonely. And one of the situations that help that not be the case, or not situations, but one of the changes that help with that is getting help. And so, as a coach, I want to ask you: there, many people will say that everybody needs a coach, a confidant, and a mentor. Do you believe those three positions or people are needed, and can they be one and the same? And if not, what would be your recommendation surrounding those: the coach, the mentor, and the confidant?
Yes, I think everybody needs somebody that they can trust. But I also think if we're putting all those people into one person, I think that's too heavy for them to carry. So, like, if you and I, went to a doctor, and let's say I've got a friend who's a doctor, and oh, yeah, I need you to work on my heart. Oh, yeah, I have this cataract issue in my eye. And oh, yeah, can you look at my foot? I've got plantar fasciitis. And, "Oh, yeah, can you help deliver my baby?" That would be ridiculous to expect one doctor to do all even though they're an MD, it would be ridiculous, and none of us would want our doctor who is working on our heart to also fix our eyes, to also handle our plantar fasciitis, and also deliver babies. We would not be okay with that, and I think it's the same way just like we wouldn't want our doctor to do that, it's the same way because not everybody's gifted. Now, if you find that person, I personally think it's a unicorn, but if you find that person, I would love to meet them. But for me, I think it's too much weight. But I do feel like pastors and people in leadership need somebody who's going to celebrate them, a cheerleader. I think people need a confidant, somebody they can talk to, somebody has great discernment. I think pastors and people in leadership, they need somebody that's going to tell them the truth regardless, hard things. And I think they need somebody who's been where they are. So if you're a pastor and you're leading a 250 member church, you need to be hanging out with a pastor who's leading a 500 member church. If you're leading a 500 member church, then you need to be hanging out with other people who are leading 500 member churches. But I'd be gaining experience or a mentor from somebody who has either been doing it longer or who has a little bit more experience. And so I'm constantly looking for people who have more experience than I have. I'm constantly looking. If I'm the 3rd grader, I'm looking for the 5th grader. But I a couple of years ago when my father passed away, I realized that I did not have a good support system. And since that time, I've tried really, really hard to be more vulnerable and ask for help more because I think up until that point, I didn't really ask for help a lot because I really didn't feel like I needed it until, I was in a situation where I didn't have a choice. And when I did reach out for help, there was nobody there or very few people there. And so since then, I've tried to build better friendships, not just what can I do for you, but intentionally ask people, hey, can you pick this up for me? Hey, can we grab coffee? But I think for me, and I think for other people in leadership, you need somebody that's going to be your cheerleader, and you know when to call them. When the sky's falling and everything's blowing up, you need that cheerleader person. You do not need the person who's going to tell you the truth. Yeah, you suck at this. This is awful. Like, you don't need that person. You need your cheerleader. I also think, when you're having to make some hard decisions around staff or around budgets or around policies or where you're going to put the light in the parking lot, you need somebody that's got some discernment and some wisdom. And that doesn't mean your cheerleader can't have wisdom. Yeah, we all need wisdom. But what I'm saying is, if you've got a particular question, you need to know the right person to ask the question to. But there have been some times in my life I just needed somebody to tell me the truth. And I didn't have anybody that was brave enough to tell me the truth. And it's not just you've got broccoli in your teeth, Denise. It's like, hey, you know what? How you handled that situation wasn't good. Or your approach was a little too abrupt. How's your time with Jesus?
Mm.
Just you need some people in your life that are just gonna tell you the truth. And so I think having those strategic relationships, are so important to not only our spiritual growth, but our personal growth. You gotta have somebody in your life who's challenging you. Hey, tell me what you're learning. Tell me what you're doing. Tell me about, how are things with you and your husband? Hey, how did that situation work out with your kid? Somebody that you allow in your Kool-Aid. It makes all the difference. So personally, I haven't found that one person who can be all those things, but, I also don't think that's healthy because what if that one person leaves? Then all of those people have all those different things that you lean so heavily on, they leave too, and I think that's a lot of times what happens on the ministry front. You have 1 or 2 people who are in all those places, and then the church asks you to leave. That's traumatic. Or, you're moved to another position, so you lose all of those connections and all those people that mean so much to you. And I think that's been the hardest thing as we've navigated through different churches and different ministries. My husband often moved me to the next place, and the church felt some kind of way about that. They felt abandoned by me, or they felt abandoned because I didn't stay in connection with them like they thought I should. And those relationships suffered because of that. And it also suffered for me because I still adore them, but because I'm not close to them, mileage wise, they kind of, they moved on and they didn't keep me. And so there's another element of loneliness. You build relationships, but when you can no longer do things with people, they kind of cut you off.
Now, I agree with you that all of those roles are important, but what I found is that the one that seems like it's most difficult to find is the one who's the confidant. We use the phrase a lot, even though we don't walk it out the way it should, in my opinion. An accountability partner. Can you talk to us? And as we get ready to move toward the close of the episode, I want to talk to and have you talk to us rather about strategies and implementation of practices that you have found successful. So here's where I'm going with this question. When it comes to finding not so much just the cheerleader or the coach, but when it comes to that confidant, because so many of us are burning out because we are isolated and because we don't have anyone that we can talk to. What would be your advice related to how to select someone that you can trust to tell those things that you can't tell everybody in the church or very few in the church? And you don't want to, for those of us who are married, you can't, just continue to share everything with your wife or your husband. At some point, there needs to be a confidant outside, some may say externally. What would be your advice to how do you find someone you can trust so that you could talk?
That's a great question. I think a lot of us, I mean, trust isn't built in one conversation, it's built over time. And I think, you just begin looking around and you ask God, who you can trust. If God is leading you in one particular question, and you're like, hey, you know what, they're showing up. They seem to have, they seem to be invested. I mean, I don't drink coffee, but I invite them to coffee. I'm like, "Hey,
With some
would you
tea.
be open to, a sweet tea?" Yeah. Are you open, would you be open to a conversation? And sometimes they think because, especially if we're in positions of authority, they think they're in trouble. So I'm like, no, this is not about the church. This is about me. And they'll be like, what's going on? Are you okay? I'm like, yeah, I'm fine. I've got a lot of really heavy things I'm carrying. And I was just curious to see if you would be open to a conversation. And usually they light up and they feel honored and they feel, "Really? Like me?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I see God in your life, and I'm just curious if, and that happens, time, little bit of time at a, it happens over time. It's not, this is all my stuff. Can you help me carry it? You'll scare people away. But I think you just look and you see, are they trustworthy? Or do they participate in gossip? Are they walking out? Do you have respect for them? Are they, and sometimes that person could be in your church, but sometimes, I mean, I recommend you find somebody outside of your church,
Same.
somebody who, is not somebody that you have to see every week or somebody that's not expecting you to show up and be on for them. That's why I lead things like leadership because it's a safe place for people to just be themselves. Nobody's asking them to do anything. Sometimes there's like a little one upish thing that goes on, well, my church is doing this. Well, my church is doing this. But usually it settles and people, they'll say something like less scary and they'll be like, so, and then, there's no judgment. And so then they bring a little bit more. And so I think as you build those people, especially the confidant, because it's so important, you've got to risk, being vulnerable a little bit and say, okay, like, would you be willing to grab coffee or can I talk to you? And sometimes it means hanging out 10 extra minutes if you're looking for that person in your current community. I'm a real advocate for finding somebody outside of the people you shepherd so that, you know, you can trust it a little bit more. It's a little bit safer. But I think that's a huge part. And it's something we all need as leaders to have somebody that we can trust and talk to.
So looking back over your journey, Denise, what has it been the 2 to 3 major big rocks that you would say that has helped you either avoid burnout so that you're still doing it some 30 years later and or recover from burnout that you could share with our audience?
I think having, intentionally plugging into the things that matter, spending time with Jesus. I'm less disciplined, so I call it my business meeting with Jesus, where we walk
Look,
through, attributes, who he is, walk through confessions. I have to do this written because my brain goes in 100 different areas. I really don't think I'm ADD, but I think I have some environmental ADD. So if you ever go in church with me, you're gonna be like, "What is she doing?" I'm taking notes because my brain's not gonna focus any other way. And my notes are like I'm drawing things and adding things and that kind of thing. But I think,
found your own lane.
you know, for for me, it's my business meeting with God. It's telling, at the beginning of my business meeting with God, you'll see the very first thing I put on there is you are God and I am not. Why I need that reminder, I have no idea. But like somehow I want to help God be God and he does not need my help. So that's like the first thing I have to confess. And so going into, who he is, his attributes, my confession time with him, gratitude. So I usually list 10 or 15 things I'm grateful for. If my attitude's really in the toilet, then it increases to like 25 or 30. And I have a little trick I play with myself. I can't repeat it for 30 days. So I'm pretty good like right now. But when it gets to be about the 28th, 29th, and 30th, our girlfriend has to get real creative. So, and then I go into all the prayer requests. And the hardest part for me is the listening part. So having that intentional time with him and then making sure I'm connected to the people, that we've talked about. Like, when's the last time you talked to this person? When's the last time you've talked to that person? And intentionally, it's my job to connect with them. It's not their job to connect with me. And I think for a long time, when I was in seasons of isolation, I was like, well, why haven't they called me? Why do I always have to call them? And I think that's just another one of the enemy's, swords, darts that he throws our way, pride, just thinking that, I need to expect this or that. But I think for me to avoid burnout is making sure that the things on my schedule, are the things that I'm supposed to carry. They're not things that other people are supposed to carry. And I think at different parts of my life, I've had 10 or 12 plate spinning all the time. And I, like most leaders, we like activity because it makes us feel productive. But just recently, God has rearranged some of my priorities. And I think I was headed to burnout and didn't know it because I was kind of successful in all these different places. And God was like, no, we're going to take care of this one. I'm like, oh, no. And so I had to kind of recalibrate some things. And now I'm very grateful for his, but I don't know that I would have done it on my own. So sometimes God does what only he can do for us that we wouldn't have chosen for ourselves. But I think for me, intentional time with God, having a community of support and realizing, the signs of burnout, realizing when the things I enjoy are not things I enjoy anymore, spending more time, at home than I'm used to spending at home and it not refueling me, recharge what used to recharge me doesn't recharge me. Like paying attention to, the things that you've talked about. This is how you avoid burnout and this is how you handle burnout. But most of us, especially women, we're in full blown blowout burnout before we ever realize it. So then we're having to kind of correct and get things back in alignment because usually we're full on and burnout before we ever realize, we're not headed there. We're already there. So then we're having to kind of backtrack and repair and and it takes a lot more effort when we don't catch it on the early end. And so now I think after doing, being in ministry so long and even after coaching so long, the coaching part is interesting because in those coaching moments, God shows up and I say things to clients I've never even thought of. And I'm like, oh man, that's good. And I realize it's not just for them, it's for me too, and and so I'm like, "Oh, I need not only, am I telling them to put this in place, I need to come, and put things in place for me too." So, but yeah, burnout, I just think we're more productive when we're not teeter-tottering on burnout. We're more productive and it's more life-giving when we have given ourselves margin.
So I said a few years back, I said my second book was going to be called I Burned Out and I Didn't Even Know. So when you said that, it's just brought back so many memories because
Write
it's
it.
so true.
Write it, my friend. Write it.
So I got to ask you this is just a few more questions in our time together. I appreciate your graciousness.
Yeah.
So one of the keys to avoiding burnout is another B word that you specialize in, and that's in setting boundaries. What would you say to the person, the ministry leader, male or female, who has a challenge creating boundaries because they feel guilty? What would you say to that person?
I'm telling you, I don't think I have one coaching session that I ever start that doesn't have the word boundaries in it. I mean, almost all of my clients are there because of lack of boundaries. And, not only do I recommend the books, but there's a quiz that you can take and all that. But boundaries are worth it because if you don't have boundaries, you're leaning into just being people pleasers at the cost of yourself, and we hear all the time, if it costs you your peace, it's too expensive. And oftentimes we don't realize that it's cost us our peace until we've said yes to the wrong thing. Yeah. Denise, can you make 3 dozen cookies? Absolutely. Can you make them for tomorrow? No. Denise, can you help me with this? Absolutely. Can you have it done tonight? No. And there doesn't need to be an excuse. No, I wish I could, but no, it's just no,
Just
period.
simple.
It's just no, period. And I think boundaries, and it's so interesting because, working with people, I usually have them do that assessment and their numbers are always surprising to themselves as well as to the people they live with. And the interesting thing with boundaries is once you begin setting them, nobody likes you. And once you have boundaries, you get really kind of upset with other people that don't have any. And so I think as you set boundaries, it's not so much saying no to all the things you love, it's saying yes to all the things that matter. And so, there's a lot of really great things I would like to be involved in, but I just don't have capacity because I'm saying yes to some other things. And one of those is like on Saturday night. On Saturdays, I don't do anything. Why? Because I'm preparing for Sunday. Well, Sunday's not here yet, but I have to mentally and spiritually and physically prepare for Sunday because it's a full, so we get invited. Hey, can we do dinner on Saturday? Wish I could. Nope, sure can't. Because I'm not going to be my best self because I'm constantly thinking my brain's already in Sunday. Is that how everybody else works? No, but I'm just telling you, like, I can't hang out with you on Saturday night. I just can't. I wish I could because if we're going to get together and we're going to have dinner and we're going to talk and eat dessert, I'm not present, one. And two, I don't want to because if I'm getting in late, then my Sunday morning self is really going to be upset with my Saturday night self. And so I can do anything you want any other night of the week, but when Saturday comes, I'm just telling you, you don't want to hang out. And it took a long time for my family to understand that, but I'm like, yeah, I want to wake up when I wake up on Saturday morning and I want to do things as a family. But the closer it gets to Saturday night, you better not. I am not available. And it's not because I'm doing a bunch of stuff. I'm just mentally preparing.
Mentally
What do I
prepared.
need to do for Sunday? Have I picked up the creamers? Is there a volunteer I need to check in with? And I try to do all those things on Thursday, but sometimes things creep up and I start getting messages. Hopefully I'm the only one that gets messages on Saturday about who's going to show up and who's not going to be there and, whatever. And so even if I try not to think about Sunday on Saturday night, I'm getting all these messages, so and so can't do safety or so and so's not going to be able to do this and can you do this? And by the way, we need you to I'm like it's so one of my boundaries is I don't do things on Saturday night. I'll do it any other night of the week, but I always say no to and every time I do say yes, my future self gets mad because I'm like, Denise, we don't do this. Remember, we don't do this. And so yeah, I think when you set boundaries, people are going to be mad at you or they're gonna be disappointed with you, and that's what we don't want people to be disappointed with us. But me saying yes to something that doesn't go that my future self's gonna be upset with, it's just not worth it, and it's not life-giving. It's the same like boundaries with parents. My mom is older now, my dad's deceased. There's boundaries there, boundaries with adult children. My children are all, reaching college age adults, and sometimes I wanna save them from things. Sometimes I know they're struggling, and you know what? I have to let them struggle because there's a lesson in that. I mean, sometimes I do feel guilty. Sometimes I think when you said that, sometimes I do feel guilty, but I have to think through what will future Denise be okay with. And you know what? A little bit of uncomfortable today is way better than a massive problem tomorrow because I said yes to too many things that were not mine to carry. Did I answer your question?
So before we leave,
Can hear you
I'd
now.
like to, you can hear me. Before we leave, I want to ask you just a couple of quick lightning round questions.
Okay.
One book that every church leader, ministry leader should read, in your opinion. What's the one?
Boundaries. The Bible and boundaries.
Bible and Boundaries. Got it. Got it. What would be? I like to use these air on Wednesdays, second Wednesdays of the month. I like to use the Hump Day Help. So, what would be your Hump Day Help for a bivocational pastor or ministry leader? What's your if you had a silver bullet? There's not one, but what would be your parting Hump Day Help words to a bivocational pastor and church leader, male or female?
Set boundaries, avoid burnout, carry less, lead more.
Love it. Love it. Love it. And what would be anything that you want our audience to know about how they can get in touch with you to get more resources from Denise Mock? All things Denise Mock, where can we find your work and your ministry, and how can we keep in touch?
Yeah, it depends on what your favorite platform is. Obviously, my website, denisemott.com. There's resources there. You can email me there, contact me there. Social media, Instagram, Facebook, Substack. There's a lot of resources on Substack. So if you're like, oh, what does she talk about? Reach out to me and I'll send them to you. The main, just reach out to me and let me know what's going on and how I can pray for you. And if I have a resource that'll help, I'll send it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for your time. I'm going to have you back because we didn't get to nearly half the questions we had planned for you, but I believe will be a blessing to our audience who listens and watches this. So thank you so much again for being with us.
Thanks for having
And
me.
blessings upon you.
I'm honored to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, thank you so much again. And for those of you that enjoyed this episode, we look forward to the next one coming up. So subscribe to the podcast, like and follow the 4040 Pastors Podcast. If today's conversation resonated with you and you've been carrying this thing along, hear me when I tell you, you're not divided, you're deployed, and you were never meant to do this by yourself. I'm actually building a space for bivocational pastors and church leaders who get exactly what these two worlds cost. If that's you, get on the wait list. There's a link in the show notes so that you're first to know when the doors open for that private space. A huge thanks today to Denise Mock. Go to denisemock.com if you want to work with her and find everything out about Denise Mock at denisemock.com. Until next time, keep your pilot lit.